Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to our convocation today. I'm not sure what kinds of posters or announcements you've seen, so just to make sure we set the stage for today. The topic that was given to our panelists for today is the question, are there modifications to humans that, assuming we can make them using morally permissible means, would still be immoral? And what are some general principles by which we could distinguish permissible interventions from not? So we're going to talk today about some of the new technologies that are not just being developed, but actually being used now in genetic engineering and genetic modifications. We have for our panel two geneticists from different perspectives, Dr. David Ronderos, Dr. Jack Boyle, and we have our esteemed philosopher, Dr. Dan Sportello.
You're esteemed.
Hopefully you know all of these folks. I will moderate and or poke at the bears to make sure that we get some lively discussion going, and we'll be sure to leave plenty of time at the end for questions from all of you. I've asked Dr. Ronderos to begin our time this morning with prayer.
All right, feel free to join me in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness. We thank you for the gift of life. We ask that you would give us wisdom in viewing our lives aright, enlighten our hearts and minds throughout this discussion. Give us joy and peace knowing that you love us, and help us to trust in your providential care of all of our needs. We pray for those in our community who are sick and those who are suffering in any way. We ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Okay, would you like to see the survey results? So let's see here. I think, hey, look, there it is. You can see this now? So for the SAT prep course, most would use, some would not use, and a few definitely would not use. If we look at the embryonic gene editing, a few would use, some not sure, many, the majority, definitely would not use. The idea for this came from an article that we saw just this week, in fact, was published. There was a study in, I forget now if it was Science or Nature, that published this. And they asked these questions to a whole bunch of people. And here's the results of the national survey. So you can see about how your results compare to the national results. People were surprised. The study authors were surprised at how high this answer was. That one of the conclusions of the study was we can't assume that if gene editing techniques are available, that it would be just a sort of rare use case. So that's what we're going to turn our attention to today. I think first we'll ask our panelists, I'm going to sit down now. What do we mean by gene editing? Can you distinguish the line between science and science fiction for us? What's available, what's going to be available, what's coming, what's here? Sure. What's happening?
I can do this one briefly. All right, so only in the last 10 years have we really had methods. We've been able to genetically modify organisms generically for several decades now, but only in the past 10 years or so have we have methods that are precise enough and sort of easy enough to do it in humans. The ways in which we're genetically modifying humans now, there's sort of two categories. So the main ones, the most advanced ones, are for anti-cancer treatments. So what you do is you remove blood from a patient, extract the immune cells that are in their blood, and then you genetically modify those immune cells to reprogram them to attack the cancer cells in that patient's body. You then release them back into the bloodstream of the patient, where they go and begin attacking the cancer cells. Thus, the idea is to eliminate the cancer that way by reprogramming the immune system. This treatment is in pretty advanced clinical trials as we speak. We've already seen individuals who have been cured of their cancers, individuals who doctors told, you have a year to live, there's nothing we can do for you, were enrolled in this trial and now are cancer-free. So fairly impressive. We don't yet know, how well this scales, but it's a potentially useful anti-cancer treatment. It's also sort of the easiest because it's much easier to do these genetic modifications outside of the human body. One of the problems is that the tools we use to make these modifications, the so-called CRISPR protein, gets attacked by the immune system. And so you have to, if you want to do modifications in a human being, you have to find ways to get the CRISPR protein to the right cells, sort of hidden from the immune system. But we've developed a few of these, and so there are very early stage clinical trials to help treat a couple of different genetic diseases where people have mutated versions of a protein that prevents them from seeing or causes their liver to produce, too many fatty substances that get excreted into the blood. I think those are the two that I saw. And so far, it looks like we've had sort of in the very beginnings, success at treating those genetic diseases by editing the, malformed organ to have the correct genes. So we're very much in the early days of this. So far, we haven't done any modifications that would be passed on to offspring. So unless the actual eggs in the ovaries or the sperm in the testes are modified, they won't get passed along. I think the only example of anyone doing a germline edit or one that would be passed on is a Chinese scientist who modified a couple of children to have a gene that would be give them resistance to HIV. So he did in vitro fertilization, and then those embryos modified them and then implanted them, and they were brought to term normally. Everyone was sort of appalled by this for a number of reasons. The main one being that these methods for gene modification can have effects on other genes that we don't really understand. And the risks of that are very low if you're modifying non-germline tissue, like maybe you increase your rate of cancer by a small amount, but it doesn't really matter. But they might be potentially very high if you're modifying germline tissue. And so this guy, there was a big international uproar. The last time I checked, this guy was disappeared by the Chinese government. And sort of that was that so far. But we do have the capability, if we want to modify germline tissues in developing embryos. And eventually we'll have the ability to do it in adults as well. So that's sort of the state of play.
Sure. Another method that's also currently being used in human patients is injecting viruses that have been prepackaged to infect cells, not with more copies of themselves, the viral genetic information that they usually contain in the virus, but instead they package the virus with all of the tools for whatever it is you want to modify. So one example was you have an individual who has some retinal degeneration disorder where they're going to go blind. It's possible to load up enough viruses of a certain titer, a certain quantity, so you can kind of predict how many cells are going to get infected. And then they put in the instructions for, here's the tools and here's a good copy of the gene that can be inserted in place of the broken gene that's causing the blindness and the cells to die. So then in this case, it's not perfect, but it'll infect the cells and then the virus can't reproduce itself. So whatever you injected, that's the total number of viral particles that they'll get.
Thank you. So one way that we'd approached framing this discussion was to think about morally permissible means and morally permissible ends. So we've just heard about some of the means that are in use to these types of genetic engineering. maybe we can let each of our panelists have a couple of minutes to give a statement of their view on the moral permissibility or lines in moral permissibility on the means. And then we can take the ends separately on for what purpose we'd see these being used. But is there anything about any of the means or any scope within the means that we'd say at this far and no further?
Do you want me to start?
I mean, that's your realm, right? You're the philosopher.
Well, it's funny. So
Yeah.
we have a bioethicist, and spoiler alert, he's not me. But he was unavailable, so I'm what you've got. So I know approximately nothing about the means. I take it all sorts of means would be or are unethical. I don't know what they are though, so I can't speak to that. As far as the ends, if we're talking about genetic medicine, as far as I can tell, it's not meaningfully different as an end than any other sort of medicine, I would think. I could be corrected if somehow I'm not seeing it. I feel, in a way, deeply unsure about everything I'm about to tell you, I should say. As far as I can tell, genetic medicine of the kind that you've been describing is not different than any other sort of medicine as an end. And assume that medicine is ethical. Well, then, genetic medicine is ethical. The interesting question is enhancement, right? Is genetic enhancement ethical as an end? Assume that the means are ethical. Is genetic enhancement ethical as an end? I guess the way I look at this is, where is the line exactly between genetic medicine and genetic enhancement? And it isn't just that it's hard to say precisely where the line is, though I think that is true. I guess even when you're not sure in some case where to draw the line between two things, there could still be a meaningful difference between the extremes, right? It isn't just that though, it's that any line that we would draw between medicine and enhancement seems to be relative to the state of our technology, right? So in 100 years, when everybody's doing it, right, if you didn't genetically enhance your child such that, they have some feature like, I don't know, say immune to the common cold. I don't think, maybe that's silly, but, then are they healthy? You would say, well, how could you have an unhealthy child? They look at them, they have a cold. So I guess barring some further argument, I have 2 pages, but I'm not going to say all of it right now. Barring further argument, it seems to me that we should see genetic enhancement as on a continuum with genetic medicine. Here's the last thing I'll say to sum up a lot. I enhance my kids in all kinds of ways. Like I send them to the best schools I can find. And I spent $9 at Costco on kimchi so that I could expose my children to a variety of cultures. Right? And I don't see a meaningful difference between enhancing my children in that sort of way and enhancing them genetically. Again, I feel deeply unsure about all. I worry that I'm missing something. There's more that I could say, obviously, but I don't want to take up too much time. Go ahead. I'm told I had 2 minutes.
So I think, like Dr. Sportello was saying, when you actually start getting into the questions, it can be really difficult to say where are we drawing the line between what's therapeutic and just trying to correct something that is not working well. So I'm going off of some ideas from Leon Cass, who is a really brilliant bioethicist, and he wrote a really important paper back in the 70s that's still influential on the end of medicine, meaning what's the goal and purpose of that. And he argues in that article that it's the well-working overall health of the body is the goal of medicine. So in therapy, you're trying to correct something that is not working well. But how many of us want to be slightly better at something, right? Whether it's you'd like to have perfect pitch when it comes to singing or hearing music, or, be a little bit smarter, have more calmness and equanimity in yourself when you're faced with a difficult situation. We work out so that we can run a little faster, right? We're constantly trying to improve ourselves in all these other ways. And that is not necessarily therapeutic in all cases, right? We're not necessarily just saying, oh, I'm trying to correct some disorder that I have. We're actually trying to enhance ourselves in all of these ways. There was I think it's an important document written by the 2003 President's Council on Bioethics called Beyond Therapy that talks a lot about this question. Leon Cass was one of the people on that, along with Marianne Glendon and Robert George. But one of the things that they point out in there is that this is fundamentally not purely a science question. Science is just a tool. But really what we're getting at is questions of how do we view our humanity, and how do we view these bigger questions about how we regard ourselves and who we're trying to make ourselves into, and to what degree are we trying to dominate and exercise power over our lives. And it's not just in science that this happens, by the way, right? People exert influence and power and have a tendency to strive to dominate and control things in work relationships, family relationships, athletic teams, you name it. Like, this happens in everybody's life, right? But there's a difference between the desire for control and dominating and the general posture of recognizing providence and seeing life as a gift and being open to receive and being grateful for the things that we are given, while also striving to be a good steward. But when you get into the question of like stewardship, then you're back to, well, what does it mean to be a good steward of all of my natural abilities?
Can I say something else?
Please.
Look, I think that's the best counter argument, actually, is the worry that inevitably genetic enhancement will become a kind of exercise in domination, or from the other perspective, a kind of exercise in consumer choice, where your children are effectively extensions of your brand or something like this, right? And I guess, so maybe this is a question of temperament ultimately. By temperament, I'm the sort of person who when he hears an argument of the form, you know, what if such and such happened? My response is, yeah, we should worry about that, rather than saying, well, that solves it, then we shouldn't do it. Maybe I'm utopian. Maybe the truth is this is such a deep worry that we shouldn't do it. But if you take it too far, look, were we all saints, then we wouldn't even need normal medicine. We would just joyfully celebrate all of our faults, right? But I'm putting it too extremely. Of course, maybe no real saint ever gets to that point. Is what I'm saying making sense? Yeah. So you talk about being a steward. I would say, look, I would be a terrible parent, a terrible steward, if you like, of my kids, were I not to educate them as best I can. Well, I mean, I buy them vitamins so that their brains function well. Is there any difference between that and genetically modifying them such that their bodies produce the vitamins on their own? You know, it just seems to me like the same sort of thing. And should we worry that this will become an exercise in domination? Yes. But I don't know that worry should be definitive. I guess ultimately the question is, how bad do you think people are? Maybe that's what it comes down to. I mean, maybe America's so terrible that we just can't trust parents with this power because they're going to make everything even more terrible. That's plausible, actually, you know.
And it's also important to remember the way that the question was set up was if there was no problem with the means. Currently, that's not the state. There's currently problems with the means that this would have to take place. But if there was no morally problematic means issue, and I think, you know, there's clear cases right off the bat where it's like, this is clearly wrong. And everybody, well, not nowadays you can't say everybody agrees on anything, right? But many of us would agree, yeah, that's clearly wrong. But I think it's also a temptation, and it's in some ways a desire to have control over the situation. Again, when we do ethical analysis, to say, I just want clear-cut, easy answers. I want black and white and say, this is wrong and this is right. And there's definitely cases where you have to say that, where you must say that. But it's also the reality that a lot of these cases, when you get into the details, that's when you see a lot of gray areas and it becomes not clear. There's things like the proper ends, the proper means, the intent behind it also has to be acceptable. And then the gravity, if you think of, I'm basically outlining like the principle of double effect, right? You have to have a good end, a good means. You can have an unintended negative consequence, but then that can't be greater than the end that you're trying to achieve. So you can't, have a horrible negative outcome and say, oh, that was just an accident. I achieved the really good little tiny thing I was trying to do.
Just to touch on the means question, the original question. So the reason that currently speaking means are unethical for a lot of these things is that it involves in vitro fertilization, which of course is like the creation of life outside of sex, of which the Catholic Church disapproves. And then the other thing, or more strongly than disapproves, I suppose I should say, and then the other problem is that in vitro fertilization usually involves the creation of a bunch of embryos and you pick one and then the rest are discarded. And currently, if you want to modify, sort of every cell in a human being, that's your way of doing it. But I don't think that that is a limitation that will be with us for very long. I think we'll be at the point where we could use morally permissible means to do basically whatever modifications we want within a few decades. So I don't think that that is like a sort of long-term concern for these sorts of things, although right now it very much is.
There's also the concern about risks, right? In reality, none of these procedures ever will become completely risk-free. This is why, like, even on your bottles of Tylenol, you can see a list of all the risks that you're taking by ingesting that drug, right? No medical procedure, especially one where you're tinkering with, somebody's genetic code, is going to be risk-free. Another consideration here that I don't think we've talked about yet is patient consent. So depending on the way that you view the status of the embryo, if you view this new individual as a human being, right, then you're dealing with another patient there. You're not just dealing with mom as the only patient involved in all this procedure, right? Same thing is true if you're generating, a dozen embryos, you pick the quote unquote best one, and then you euthanize essentially the rest, right? You've really, selected one human being and you've killed 11 human beings, right? That's important to keep in mind in all this. Also, think about the long-term consequences that would be involved in this one individual's life. So you are genetically modifying an individual in a way that will permanently change every cell in their whole body for their whole life and in their descendants' lineage forever, right? When we're talking about it in embryos, I think it's a lot easier to sort of accidentally depersonalize them a little bit. But just imagine that you're sitting around and you look over and there's another adult your age, right? And they have some genetic issue that maybe you happen to diagnose. Let's say that you're brilliant and you know a lot of medicine and you're like, oh, I can see exactly what they have, right? Would it be morally permissible to like take a virus and just like pretend to sneeze it on them and genetically modify their whole body and fix their disease without telling them or anything? I think most of us recognize that there's a problem with that. So, with parental consent and treating kids, we do this all the time. We have to make decisions for the kids, of course, but it is something worth considering. Another consideration I'll just throw out there is more more things that you need to think about with a problem like this is we already mentioned the commodification of human life as one potential issue. Another one is the way that it changes social relationships or parent-child dynamics, right? Even with all of us having, who have been fortunate and blessed to have really wonderful, loving parents, you go through phases in life where your parents are the dumbest jerks in the world, right? And then, when I'm older now and I have my own kids, I'm finally appreciating, like, wow, my parents are amazing because this job is hard and I am bad at this. My parents were awesome. I didn't know it. Just imagine how that dynamic would be skewed if you knew that you were the way you were because your parents directly, deliberately made you that way somehow, right? Even if it, quote unquote, worked, okay? But you are dissatisfied with some either direct or indirect consequence of that modification that you received. Also, think about the way this could influence the way we relate with each other in society, right? If we're just
Can I ask a follow-up question actually to the parent point?
Yeah, I'm talking too much, sorry.
Do you think that orthodontia has that effect now, right? Because like you're 12, you don't really consent to the orthodontics, right? Like your parents tell you you're gonna go get braces now because they want your teeth to be straight instead of scraggly. They've made you the way that they want. Do you think that that has a harmful effect? I mean, the answer could be yes.
My daughter got braces this week.
So very timely. You can report back next year at our next panel.
I don't know, but I probably won't sleep tonight now.
I'm sorry.
I mean, look, can I just say,
Yeah.
Forget about genetic modification or medicine. Just in medicine, we have all kinds of epistemological issues like this all the time where whether we like it or not, our choices for others will be informed by some substantive conception of the human good, right? Like, what should we withhold care from this person who's comatose or not, right? Well, it's, good luck getting them to answer. They're comatose. Right? I'll just look. I mean, I think I'm going to half agree with you and half disagree. Is it easy to imagine a child who says, right? So think about right now. My daughter says, "Why did you make me this way?" I'll say, "It wasn't really up to me. I just picked the hottest person I could find." But in 100 years, she'll say, "Why did you make me this way?" And I'll say, "I don't know. That was kind of the trend at the time." And so, I mean, yeah, that could be tough. But on the other hand, imagine that, I didn't genetically modify my kids when everyone else was doing it. So why didn't you make me as smart as everyone else in class? Why am I the dumbest person in class? I'll say, yeah, that does seem like a mistake in hindsight. Sorry.
Yeah. I was going to mention the movie Gattaca.
Everyone does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You should watch it. If you have no idea what we're talking about, Gattaca, it's a made-up word with the letters A, T, C, and G, right? So the genetic code, so Gattaca. But it's a really thought-provoking movie about this kind of scenario.
Before we turn it over to audience questions, I'd like to probe this question of better, right? The conception of better.
Sure.
Because I think we have examples in human history where we don't need genetic engineering to go off the rails on this question, right? We have several eugenics movements, right?
Yeah.
Where we've had some conception or misconception of what it means for society to move our species sort of, you mentioned collective action, right? In a better direction, right? Through genetic enhancements, right? And everybody's doing it, right? We're all going to get better, right? Healthier, fitter, right? It seems to me that this opens new avenues, right? You say, how bad can we get? I don't think we have to look far back in our history to realize how bad we can get and how quickly this can go off the rails.
Look, you might worry that, while in a utopia, we should carefully allow parents to genetically engineer their children. In fact, just it's way too dangerous to allow the median parent to do this, to make choices like this. That's not crazy to me. I mean, I'll just say, look, as far back as Plato has this fantasy of breeding a master race of scholar athletes, right? Like it's absurd, and it's absurd, not
And
just
not poets.
yeah, right.
Do poetry.
Not just because it's kind of weird, but also because he's thousands of years too early in terms of his genetic knowledge, right? And even, I mean, if you want to pick other examples of eugenics from the early 20th century, it's the most famously culminating in, Auschwitz. I mean, there's a few problems there. One problem is there's a big difference between improving
It's
people.
an understatement, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so what I think should be cautiously explored would be improving individuals, taking individuals embryonically, let's stipulate for now, improving individuals in ways that they would rightly come to appreciate later, versus taking people who you don't like and murdering them. Like, that's not okay, right? In addition to the utter ludicrousness of just I won't even say it's immoral, it's more like just stupid. Like the idea that being Jewish or Roma or something makes you lesser, it's obviously wildly racist and evil, but even more so just dumb. Right. But
it's always gone together, right? I mean,
Well,
Sanger and American eugenics, right? Sterilization, right? It seems like it's always gone together. When we have this sort of cultural eugenics, it seems like there's always this dark side of can we have the one without the other?
well, maybe not. I mean, maybe everyone is too stupid and terrible, in which case, yeah, I guess then we should, yeah, if the price of genetically modifying our kids is a culture of death, then I guess we shouldn't do it. Yeah. I hope that that's not true,
Can I bust in with one more means discussion? Because I do think it's relevant. So the sort of things that are on the table over the next few decades in terms of genetic modification of humans are genetic modifications to cure diseases. So genetic diseases like Huntington's or cystic fibrosis or ALS or something like that. And the reason that those are on the table now is because they're low-hanging fruit. These genetic diseases are caused by usually a single mutation. And that single mutation has lots of bad consequences, but it is fixable at one place in the genome. If we're talking about things like, well, I would like to make my children smarter, or I would like to make my children taller, or I would like to make my children have a lower risk of heart disease or something like that. These sorts of things are typically traits, almost always traits that are what are called polygenic, meaning that there's lots of different genes that affect that trait, and each gene affects it in a very small way. So your intelligence is largely genetic, maybe half genetic, something like that. It's hard to say, but that intelligence is contributed to by, 1,000 genes, all of which make you 0.1% more or less intelligent. And what's worse is that every single one of those genes, so you could identify here's the top 100 genes, and we can make 100 modifications. I mean, we don't have the ability to do that now, but in theory, you could make 100 modifications and make your child 5% smarter or something like that. But the problem is that those 100 genes don't just affect intelligence. They also affect a ton of other things. And it's not there are no free lunches here. It's not like the modification to make you more intelligent will also make you better at all the other things that the gene affects. In fact, there's almost always going to be trade-offs. So you make your child 5% smarter with those modifications, but you might make them live 3% less long and make them 3% shorter and make them 3% less blonde, or whatever the things that you care about are. It's in fact going to be extremely difficult, and I sort of suspect impossible, to find a lot of trade-off free modifications. So I would be quite surprised if there are, in fact, much of a market in the next 100 or 200 years, at least, of sort of we can vaguely foresee the science in modifying your children beyond just curing diseases.
Okay, one more question for me, and then we're going to open up to the audience, because it was just raised here, right, in a couple of ways. And I think in these types of conversations, I like to ask all of you, who should decide? Right, we talk about this, we've got a couple of practicing scientists, we've talked about parents, we've talked about other organizations, right? With big issues like this, right? Things that affect our work in science, things that affect us as parents or as a society as a whole. Who should decide, right? Should somebody stop the guy in China before he can get going, right? Is there something where we should be able to just, at some point, should somebody who just say absolutely not? Is there always going to be the rogue somebody who's 10 years ahead and doing something really ridiculous? Who decides how when?
For everyone. I'm into it.
With reference to Plato.
That's true. Yeah.
I mean, so I'll paraphrase an argument from Aristotle and say that leaving each individual parent in charge of their own kids may be the least bad, the least dangerous of a series of bad options.
Within limits, though, right?
Sure,
We don't
well,
give
indeed,
parents free rein to do whatever
indeed.
they want with their kids, right?
Indeed.
So, like the way we make decisions like this right now is a combination of having experts in the technical side of it, hopefully in conversation with ethicists and other leaders who are going to examine other potential consequences of how this is going to affect economics, which is also not, morally neutral in any of these decisions either, right? What you do with the money of a country matters, right? Because if you're doing this good thing, you're not doing the other good thing. That's principle of double effect. You can't avoid it in life. So yeah, there's a lot of decisions that go into right now what things are allowed or not allowed in hospitals. And those decisions aren't always correct, right? The decisions that are handed down don't always work out. And will always be that way in the fallen world that we inhabit.
Yeah, I think our current mechanisms for determining whether non-genetic treatments suffice for genetic treatments.
Your turn.
You're the moderator. You pick.
Well, Annie has the microphone, so she's
Annie gets to
in
pick.
charge
Okay,
of
this
these
is
all
Yeah,
things.
there you go. You're off the hook.
Shannon.
Hello, my name is Joseph. So Dr. Sportello, something you mentioned, and I want to kind of paraphrase because I didn't catch the exact quote, but you mentioned the idea that a child will come to appreciate the genetic modifications. And I want to touch on that a little bit because something that we learn, especially in psychology, is being grateful, but being grateful for things that you should be grateful about. So do you see genetic modifications as something you should be grateful for, or is it going to be something that is going to be continuously controversial as we age in the idea of sciences and genetic modifications and how those will change over time versus what we have precisely now and what we can say, well, if like I'm HIV resistant, I'm going to be grateful for that. But like in 5 years time, if I could be HIV resistant and more intelligent, am I going to be grateful for that just HIV resistant?
Let me see if I understand the question. Is the question, once the process of technological development gets going, then in any given year, you will just be looking nostalgically to slightly younger people who are more modified than you, something like that?
In addition to the fact that should you be grateful for something that you, in essence, have no control over and that in a way is unnatural to how you would have been originally created?
I mean, in general, I suppose gratitude is for that which is not entirely in your control, right? If something is entirely up to you, who would you be grateful to? I guess yourself, but it's not usually how we use the word. Look, I mean, I didn't mean to leave this ambiguous. I'm an Aristotelian, at least in some sense. I'm an Aristotelian. I think that there are objective goods. I mean, if you want to put this in this way, I guess I'm also a Platonist in a sense. None of us is healthy. If we were healthy, we would be God, right? So in some sense, I see genetic modification, and indeed all modification, as just another form of medicine trying to elevate us insofar as we can towards what is objectively good. You know, I think about intelligence because I'm a nerd, but being smarter rather than less smart, right? For example, should one be grateful for that? Yes, definitely. Am I answering you? I'm not sure. Okay.
I would also just add that I think through the gift of our faith and a real deep belief in God's providence, there is a lot more that you can be grateful for than just the apparently good things that happen in our lives. And to believe that everything, absolutely everything, is turned for good for those who love God. That's really important. I'd recommend Uniformity with Divine Providence by St. Alphonsus Liguori is a good short read on that.
So it was mentioned that one of the ethical concerns with genetic modification is that the person and their descendants would carry that modification for the rest of their life. But I'm wondering, like, if we have the ability to genetically modify someone, why would we have the ability to ungenetically modify them? That didn't work out.
You could do that, yes. It depends on it's more complicated than that, but yes, and you could, modify yourself and then like unmodify your, testes or ovaries if for some reason you wanted to pass on Lou Gehrig's disease to your children or something like that. Or if it was, actually, I don't like being blonde anymore, like that kind of thing. It is no longer in fashion.
And also, a simple way is development. So some of these changes affect the way that development happens. And once you're developed, you can't shrink back down and do it over again, right?
Yeah. So the adult stuck, but the next generation is not necessarily.
Mandy.
Okay, so my question is, at what point are we using our rational inquiry that is given to us by God to improve our lives and, I guess, do what we can to help other people? And then at what point are we trying to actually be God?
That's a good question.
Is there a distinction between the two? Like, aren't we sort of supposed to be God? Or isn't God calling us to do his work? Like,
Depending on how you mean it, right?
That has to come from above, though, in Christian tradition. You can't seek it out. Right? That's what Tower of Babel is all about. Right? They try to become gods themselves. That doesn't work. Right? So God has to come down in the incarnation to bring us up. If we try to make ourselves into gods, that always seems to be bad.
I am also going to comment on it. Though there's something wholesome about what you said. Look, what I'm tempted to say is this, actually. I think I'm, in a way, on your side. There would be a point of modification, a degree of modification. I think we're probably 500 years away from this level of technology, but there would be a point of modification where you're so modified that you're no longer making human nature what it ought to have been, but rather making an entirely different kind of nature. Maybe to put the most obviously problematic version of this, if you decide, this is a vale of tears, better to be a pig satisfied than a human dissatisfied. And so you modify your kids so that they don't have rationality. Like, the best thing you could say about that is you're not really giving birth to humans anymore. The worst thing you could say about it is that it's an appalling crime. So I think there is a degree of modification beyond which you're no longer improving. But I mean, there's a divinity in us, I think at least that much. That's why it occurred to us to build the tower up super high. so spatially confused slightly.
Hi, so we've been mainly talking about like physical genes that we're going to be editing, whether it's like into whether it's some of our organs or different things like that. But what about editing genes that deal with temperament? So dispositions towards agreeableness or openness, right? So, and is there a type of analogy that could be made about wanting to change, say, your color blindness versus your own temperament? Because as in Catholic tradition, we are both body and mind. So how would that be changing you, who you are as a person?
So I think this gets to one of the challenges with the whole distinction between what's therapy and what's, just mere improvements. And one of the challenges is figuring out what's actually better. Right? So there's a lot of different temperaments, and it can be tempting to think, oh, this is the good temperament, but we need all kinds of people in the world. And I don't know, do you want your kids to be more compliant, or do you want them to be more independent and assertive? There's benefits to both, right?
I will
Yeah.
say though, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I will say though, if I think it's at least this much shouldn't be problematic to say. If you knew that you were a carrier of a gene that would make your children wildly aggressive or depressive or something like this, it's not just reasonable but obligatory for you to that would actually, I would not even count that as enhancement, but rather as medicine. You could disagree with me, but you would be wrong.
And being a body and soul composite, it's important to remember that the way that our bodies works often affects our spirits as well, our souls. So, exercise and sleep can do a lot to help you have more gratitude, which is a spiritual quality, right? It's easier to be grateful when you are not feeling miserable.
Okay, so Anya and I kind of combined our questions, but we were kind of wondering, like, who keeps the physicians and the geneticists in check, like, while they're performing these tests and trials? Because there's currently physicians who are performing abortions and they're not being punished, and we know that that's like morally wrong. And then we also talked about kind of what Maddie was saying about the concept of playing God, and like fetal surgery is one of those where it's like, are you overstepping your bounds as a human person? So basically, like, who holds doctors and physicians accountable for ensuring their actions are moral? And does the church have a primary role to play in that accountability?
Yeah, I think that the church is offering, authoritative guidance on not just faith, but morals as well. And ideally, in a perfect world, that guidance would be sought after zealously and adhered to by everybody. But who's keeping the doctors in check? A lot of times it's top-down legal, essentially rulings or instruction, right? The law is also instructive.
I mean, it's a great question. I'm glad you asked it, because the answer is society, right? And I think a lot of times we like to say, oh, look how evil science is, because the scientists are these weird other people that we don't need to worry about. But in fact, like, the scientists are just doing what society tells them to do. Like, when scientists are doing evil things, it's our fault, right? Like, we are evil. Like, society is evil. And that is why we see all of this, experimentation with embryos. It's not because like scientists are uniquely evil. Like, look at how scientists treat animals. It's nuts. Like, we're so constrained in what we can do to a rabbit or a mouse, largely voluntarily, partly by law, but largely just sort of because scientists have decided that. So it's not like scientists are these like raving maniacs trying to destroy everything we can touch. Like, we take our cues from society about what is valuable and what is not. And so we value rabbits and we don't value embryos. I mean, I'm using we, like I'm not busy doing embryo research, to be clear, but and I think like society has the most important role in this, partly through law and just partly through a consensus over what is good and bad. And I would love for the church to be, more involved than it is in setting society. Like that is, I think, how we make these things better, probably.
Yeah, moms and teachers teaching children who are going to grow up to become doctors and scientists who are interested in this and have technical skill set, teaching them, more than just science, right? Teaching them the difference between right and wrong and all those other good things.
I know we could talk about this all day, but we need to make sure that we're mindful of our daily schedule. Please join me in thanking our panel. This is